Welcome to episode 2 for splattergore. I'm happy you joined me for the second episode. Last week was really good. I loved the episode, so let's talk about this week's. Now, this is not like your traditional news show, but this week I've decided to talk about what are the greatest horror movies ever. When you talk about the greatest horror movies ever, a lot of people try to judge their point. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to talk about until the very end what I think my favorite is, but I'm going to talk about you can't call the greatest because there's subgenres. There's horror movies that pave the way for other movies that you would not really expect. Like you have Black Christmas, which paved the way for Halloween, but Halloween paved the way for Friday the 13th and all the slashes that would follow. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the reason we had Saw, we had Hostel, we had a lot of those torture movies. The Exorcist was the reason why we have all these supernatural movies that have come out. Amityville Horror, you can put in that. Hellraiser is the reason we have over-the-top torture, borderline S&M. So, a great horror movie, like a lot of people would want to put Scream in that category. I wouldn't. A lot of people might want to put Saw in there or Hostel, but it's hard to put a movie like that which hasn't been around for that long. A great horror movie is a movie that, to me, is like 20 or 30 years old, has withstood the test of time. Poltergeist is a really spot on because since then, a lot of people have watched Poltergeist. A lot of people have taken things from Poltergeist. So, I would assume that Poltergeist is one of the movies that should be in the top 10 of all time. Now, another movie that really should be in there. The series got really comical later, but I think A Nightmare on Elm Street, the very first Nightmare on Elm Street, should really be put in that category. Because the first one was not funny. There was not these whimsical things that Freddy would say. It was straight up horror in your face. Freddy was really scary in that first one. It's actually the first horror film I've ever seen in my life. Was A Nightmare on Elm Street when I was about 4 years old. And it really, if you think about it, the dreams, the knives, everything. Nightmare on Elm Street was a really good film. And yes, it spawned a lot of bad sequels, but Nightmare on Elm Street has stood the test of time. They tried to remake it and it didn't go that well. But I think it was a really good horror film. And what most people don't know is Wes Craven had that script for like 5-6 years. And Wes Craven came from Last House on the Left, which was another great horror film. But Nightmare on Elm Street has stood the test of time. It's a really, really good film. Robert Englund is really good in there. Johnny Depp in his first movie role ever was really good. Wes Craven directed it, was good. Heather Langenkamp was good in her role. So was John Saxon. It was a really good, well put together film. And it's the film that saved New Line Cinema. That one's really good, but let's talk about Evil Dead. Now, Evil Dead is a comical horror film, I ain't gonna lie, but Evil Dead has stood the test of time as well, and is a horror classic, and is a great horror film. Now, as much as I love Evil Dead, would I put it in the top 10? No. Because I can look at films subjectively and say that yes, Evil Dead was great, but how much did it really hold dear to horror films in general? It was a great movie, had a great cast, but if I was going to pick one besides Evil Dead that you really have to put in the top 10, it would actually be the 1931 Dracula with Bela Lugosi, Universal Pictures, black and white. It's my favorite vampire movie that's ever been made, and I really think that Bela Lugosi was perfect in that movie. And you had They had Hellsing in there, and it built all the mythology. And if you really look at vampire movies nowadays, they've all taken something from the original Dracula. Now, I know Nosferatu came before it, but Dracula was perfect. The Hammer films took stuff from it. Interview with the Vampire took stuff from it. Twilight took stuff from it. It was a completely different annihilation. It completely changed what horror films were. And I really, if you haven't seen it, I actually found it recently on YouTube, and you can really get into it. The next one on the list that you have got to talk about is, as much as I don't like it, a lot of people claim it to be the scariest horror film ever made, the greatest horror film ever made. I'm of course talking about The Exorcist. Now, I don't like The Exorcist because I don't like supernatural movies, except for movies like Poltergeist, The Conjuring, Suspiria. But The Exorcist is good when it gets to the second and third act. Now, one of the reasons I don't call it the greatest horror film ever made is because you have about an hour of boring shit that people when they watch certain films, they forget about certain aspects of films to credit them and put them higher up on the list. To me, you can't discount the first act, because yeah, it was building. Exorcist is like a slow burn film, not really one of my favorites. I'm not really into it. People say it's one of the greatest movies to come out of the 70s, and I can think of two other ones, which I will discuss. But what I'm going to do now is talk about my top 4 favorite. Okay? Now, these will be different from anybody else's, but my top 4 are, at number 4, I would always put the Phantasm movie. Phantasm is a great film. A lot of people have not seen it. They actually take people and put them into these little silver balls to attack people, and then they take corpses, turn them into these little Jawa-looking motherfuckers, and you have the tall man in there, and it's a very intricate. The story is what brings it. It's the story and the acting. It's not gore. It's not violence. It's the story. And Phantasm is a classic from the 1980s. The writing in there is amazing. The directing is really good. There's a lot of gold shots in there, and I really like it. It's a great film. It's a movie that you can go back to and you can look at it for your artistic standpoint, or for filmmaking. You can actually get a good idea of, if you want to make a horror film, this is a good way to make one. Now, it's really good. Phantasm 2 wasn't that good though, but Phantasm 1 is a great horror film and should always be put in its place in the echelon of horror films. At number 3, I would put the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, Texas Chainsaw Massacre was as simplistic as you get. A bunch of teenagers driving through West Texas, they pick up a hitchhiker, and what you don't realize is they go to a gas station, and then they go find the hitchhiker, and then it's like all these things you shouldn't do when you're driving through cross country. You shouldn't piss off the locals. You shouldn't go into somebody's house that you don't know. And it just further, and Leatherface is awesome in this one. I love Leatherface in this one. I like Grandpa in this one. I like the dad in this one. I like Leatherface's brother. The end sequence is really cool. they don't kill off the killer at the end of it. This could really happen, as Leatherface was based on Ed Gein, and Ed Gein was a very sick motherfucker. But Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Tobe Hooper, I love Texas Chainsaw Massacre so much, I watched a 6-hour documentary on how they filmed it, and they used all those animals and bones in the movie are real. They are real, decaying bones, flesh, skin, everything. And Tobe Hooper would later go on to do Poltergeist, The Mangler, The Toolbox Murders, among other shit in his career, but he will forever be remembered as the writer and director of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And this one was so good. The dinner scene is awesome. You really hate Franklin when you're watching the movie. Sally's a really good heroine in this movie, and one of the first heroines in horror films to actually survive the ordeal. Now, coming in at number 2 is a movie that I don't think the cult fans give it enough credit, but I don't think mainstream gives it enough credit for what it did. Without this movie, I don't think people would have made Saw. I don't think people would have made Hostel. I'm of course talking about it. Clive Barker's Hellraiser, the very first Hellraiser, because this movie was ahead of its time. Clive was trying the makeup effects in there, and it was a rarity back then for a writer of a novel to take his novel and direct it himself, his first ever directing. And he actually tried so hard to direct this movie the right way. And what people don't realize is Stephen King doesn't even direct his own movies. Neither does Dean Koontz or a lot of people. But Clive went out there because he wanted to make this as good as he could make it. And the special effects in there. The character of Kirsty, the mom, the dad, Frank, the Cenobites, which you don't see the Cenobites that much in this movie, but really they make it. Pinhead is such a classic character, and it's such an old school tale of curiosity killed the cat. It's a puzzle box. You don't open the puzzle box, it doesn't hurt you. You try and mess with the puzzle box, it's like opening Pandora's box. You don't know what you're gonna get. Hellraiser was such a good movie. And they were fighting an X rating when it came out, because it was so... They pushed the bar like that much, and that much, then that much, then that much. And you just can't discount that film. It is a great horror film. A little bit of S&M in there. But it's really good. It's a really good horror film. Now, what I consider to be the greatest horror film of all time, is John Carpenter's Halloween. You have a story that nobody had ever done, but you're like, wow, why didn't someone do it before? Of Michael Myers killing on Halloween. Now, you don't know why he's attacking people, but in Halloween, he's not called Michael Myers in the credits. He's called The Shape. But in that one, there's such good kills, camera shots, the music, good acting by Donald Pleasance and Jamie Lee Curtis, and multiple people played Michael Myers, and you don't really get a lot of Smith Grove in there, but I think it's a really good film. I really do. Halloween, set the premise for your Friday the 13th, and everything that came after it. A whole genre tried to repeat. For the longest time, Halloween was the #1 grossing horror film of all time. And what people don't realize is Halloween was an independent studio film, and it went from market to market. So what that means is they went through this market, and then they would go through another market, and then we go through another market. So word of mouth started to build, and people were saying this is the scariest movie ever made. And the theme song has become so iconic that people know, oh, they hear the song, oh, Halloween. You cannot go, when people think of horror, they think of Halloween. I can't count how many times I've seen people wear Michael Myers masks, how many Halloween tattoos I've seen, how beloved the franchise became. Like, more than Friday the 13th, more than Nightmare on Elm Street, people got so beloved with it, hated when it got ruined. It was such a great horror film. Now, these are my opinions on them, but we are going to switch gears, and we're going to talk about new age horror movies / remakes. Now, what we've seen as a trend in the last 10 to 15 years is people trying to remake classics. You had steps forward, like the Amityville Horror remake, the Friday the 13th remake, the Texas Chainsaw remake, and we saw steps back. Steps back would be the Nightmare on Elm Street remake, the Prom Night remake, Fright Night could go good or bad, American Werewolf in Paris, even though that's an older remake. But a lot of people have been trying to make remakes. And in development right now, there is the It remake that's being filmed right now. They're trying to remake Child's Play. They're trying to remake Hellraiser. They're doing prequel movies for Friday the 13th, for Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I know there was talk of them doing a Pet Sematary remake. They did the Carrie remake. Evil Dead had a remake, even though it's actually a sequel. Don't tell anybody. It's like fatigue. All these people trying to do reboots, remakes. I don't hate them, but if you're gonna remake something, you gotta give your own take on it, make it better, and not shove it into the ground, which is what some people do. The best way I could say to make a remake is how they did the Friday the 13th. They took the best elements from Friday the 13th 1, 2, 3, and 4. They threw it in a blender, and you got a Jason who was smarter, more intelligent, and you didn't have to go over the top violence, which was different from the Halloween remake with Rob Zombie, where he really went and he upped the violence, trying to make it destructive, trying to make it chaotic, and it just was way too over the top. I think if you're going to do a remake, you've got to do it right. But in all these spiels of remakes, we have had some original ideas since the year 2000. We had the Final Destination franchise, which the first one was cool, but then it started to go. You had Paranormal Activity, which, as much as I don't like found footage, that's just a preference. A preference doesn't mean that the movie's not good. My girlfriend really likes the Paranormal Activity movies, and I literally state that they're good for the franchise. They were something new, something different. And you had movies like Wolf Creek, which is a new good take, Australian serial killer. You don't see that often. But we saw two franchises emerge. One made way too many sequels and started being discombobulated. One made two sequels, and then the studio made a third one. I'm of course talking about Hostel and Saw. Hostel and Saw, well, Hostel had, first one was really good, second one was even better. Now, what most people don't know with Hostel 3 is Eli Roth had nothing to do with it. The studio basically said, we own the name Hostel, we're going to take it, and we're going to do what we want to do. And what they did is they ruined the confines of what Hostel was. They took it out of other countries. They put CG shit in there, turned it into a game show, and the fans said, fuck this shit. It was bullshit. The fans hated it. And then you have Saw. Saw 1 through 7, I think it was. And what happened was, with every movie, they just, every October, boom, 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 boom. Another one every year. And it just, the fans were like, they started to dwindle and dwindle and dwindle. And once you killed off Jigsaw, it kind of ruined it. Because then they're trying to fill this plot hole, fill that plot hole, fill that plot hole, and it turned into a bunch of shit that you couldn't get back. It was crap. And it's just, Hostel and Saw, I think Hostel could be saved. Saw should go away for a long time. Maybe bring it back in another 10 years. And it could be something new and different. See, every once in a while you find these horror films that kind of break the boundaries, but it's hard. When so much things have been over and done, I think the best thing for all these fans to do is that want to make horror films. Me, myself, I want to make horror, is to reinvent it. Put your take on something that's been done before, whether it be the slasher genre, the torture one, supernatural, exorcism, dolls, puppets, whatever. But take your spin on it. Make it something unique to you. Don't just try and be a carbon copy of something else. Because everybody, this is my advice to you. Wouldn't you rather fail at doing something original to you, or fail at being a carbon copy of something else? Well, that's the show for this week. I will see you next week for Splattergore. It will be episode 3, and I'll see you next week.